So I'd like to invite the writer Mike Parker. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his books. Mike's going to take a different look of on the landscape of the medieval marches now, looking at the impact and what we still see today. Is that right? As you travel around looking at the imprint of the echoes and the memory that we find as we travel around this wonderful landscape. Mike's written several books. Some are here today and has a website as well. But I won't take up any more of your time and welcome Mike Parker to the stage.
Cam? Well, good afternoon. Is that all? Am I plugged in? Am I booming? Yes, good. Okay. Well, it's a great fun to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real honour to address such a learned and frankly terrifying crowd. I know that if I get anything wrong, there's going to be repercussions. So here goes. So yes, the idea, as Pam outlined, really was to look in the pursuit of a book, my latest book, All the Wide Border, Wales, England, and the places between, which of course has got much of a crossover with your work. What I wanted to talk about really was the stuff how the polity of the Middle Ages and the polity of the March of Lordships is still so evident on the ground today, and particularly in the research of my book. And you know, if you're in any doubt of how strong the echoes of yesterday are on today, look no further than the map on your own website, on the Mortimer History Society front page of the website. There's the map of the patch that concerns you. If we overlay it with maps of, say, of Wales, looking at, say, the spread of the language, you know, you can see just how clearly, all these years later, even if we overlay it with a map of people's voting habits, there's a general election result from the last general election in 2019, Plaid Green, Tory Blue, Labour Red. So, you know, this is what I'm looking for, is the echoes that we see today, both in the landscape and sort of in culturally as well. So this is my book, All the Wide Border, and this is the map that introduces the beginning of the book. So what I was looking at was the border between Wales and England as a geographical reality, as a line on the map, but also as a line through a good couple of thousand years of history. But more than that, I wanted to look at it as a line through myself. I mean, I'm from Worcestershire, I live in Powys, I've spent half my life in England, half my life in Wales. But through many of us as well. It's a line that runs through us, like lettering in the stick of seaside rock, in a way. Also a line through Britishness, through our concepts of Britishness and what it means. You know, once upon a time, you know, the very word British was a sort of synonym for Brythonic, for what we would call Welsh, really. You know, it's particularly in a linguistic way. And the word British sort of slid over the last few centuries into becoming more of a synonym for English, more often than not. So I wanted to look at that as well. And then, just as I was starting to write it, the pandemic happened, and that became one of the stories through the book as well, because of course suddenly the border became much harder on the ground than it had been in any of our lifetimes, had really been for centuries. So I'll just start by reading you a couple of paragraphs of the very beginning of the book, the prologue to the book. And we're starting here on the Severn Bridge. Prologue, Thursday the 8th of September, 1966. Daytime television was a distant dream in black and white Britain. But on a grey midweek morning in 1966, there was something special. A 90-minute live outside broadcast of the Queen opening the new Severn Bridge. Viewers watched her arrive at Aust, on the English bank of the river, shake a lot of hands and give a little speech, before climbing into her official car and being driven across the bridge to do it all again, to a rather smaller crowd, at the Newhouse roundabout on the Welsh side. The second ceremony, according to a spokesman for the royal household, was almost as important as the first. In an instant, the bridge became visual shorthand for the border, for the coming together of two old neighbours, an outstretched handshake high above the silver tides. 30 years later, a second bridge was added, longer and even more graceful than the first, and together their elegant functionalism became the icon not just of a line on the map, but of a tangled ancient relationship too. No TV producer could resist their gimcrack symbolism, the soaring shots and swollen soundtracks. You can't blame them. Finding the essence of this furtive border is a notoriously fraught occupation. Crossing the divide, there's almost always some disjunction to be found or felt, but peer too closely or light it too brightly, and it might just evaporate. The march, the middle land, is a will-o'-the-wisp. Hill forts and castle mounds growl from the green, church bells toll in lonely sunset skies, lanes twist and creak through the woods to take you where you least expected. Even the names on the map refuse to choose a side, are written in a mash of two languages that have coupled in a hayrick and spawned a beautiful bastard third. To Mary Webb, this is the country that lies between the dimpled lands of England and the gaunt purple steeps of Wales, half in faerie and half out of it. And in its very mutability lie so many of its truths. When travelling from England into Wales, it is invariably so that the greens swell deeper, the contours sharper, and the crags sulkier, but in ways that are somehow both imperceptible and sudden. No less a stereotype, crossing into Wales often seems to provoke a downpour, as if the two countries are governed from different heavens. And perhaps they are. For all the egalitarian pose of the Severn Bridge, you need not go far either side of it to be reminded that these are neighbours of radically, almost comically mismatched weight and wealth. So that idea of things being both imperceptible and yet sudden, of being a border, a line that's both sharp and baggy all at the same time. It's this area of contradiction. It feels remote. I mean, I live near Machynlleth now. Technically, of course, in the sort of British, on the British map, that's much more remote, yet somehow most parts of the borderland feel further away than Machynlleth or Aberystwyth do. You know, it's a sort of paradox in geography. So trying to think about how to structure all the wide border. Well, I sort of fell back on the Marcher model in a way, because I took the three great rivers. Every single drop of rain that falls on the border will either end up in the Dee in the north, in the Severn in the middle, or in the Wye in the south. You know, and the earldoms, if you like, of Chester and Shrewsbury and Hereford. So yes, it's a sort of a long-standing echo that is already there from the outset. And I chose the rivers as the watersheds, really, the basins, as my dividing structure, because, well, I've got to be honest, it was a kind of a cutesy trick at first. You know, I was to take a man-made border, the line drawn up by a clerk in the Tower of London in the 1530s as part of the so-called Act of Union of 1536. That's when the line that we know today was kind of forged. But to take that man-made line and to contrast it with the natural borders of the rivers, that was the sort of thinking behind it. But actually they became far, far more important in the story than my slightly kind of cutesy, tricksy idea of that. And about half of the 160-mile border is down rivers. So, you know, the obvious way to do it would have been to start at one end, start in, you know, the Dee estuary and way down to the Severn, or the other way around. No, I don't do the obvious way around. I wanted to start right in the middle. So with my river as well, because the Severn is my basin. I grew up in Kidderminster in Worcestershire, went to school in Worcester, now live just beyond its source in the mountains of mid Wales. So, you know, that was my middle, was my river. And so the Severn is all the kind of middle section. That, by the way, is a bridge between the Welsh village of Crew Green and the English Shropshire village of Melverley. It's an old railway bridge that was repurposed when the railway shut. It was the old railway to the Criggian quarries. When that shut in the 1940s, it was repurposed as a lane, and it's still open as a lane today. And that's the real Severn Bridge. That's because the weird thing is, for all that the Severn is the longest river in the land, For all that it's a great border river in so many ways, there's only 1 mile in its whole progress, all its 220 miles, where the Wales-England border and the River Severn actually coincide. And that is the only bridge upon that 1 mile of River Severn. So that's the real Severn Bridge. Then going to the north, looking at the Dee Basin. Now, this was the area that I knew by far the least. And it was fascinating to do. I absolutely loved the research, but I've got to say I came away from it still feeling, like it wasn't really mine. The lands of the Severn, I definitely feel are mine. The lands of the Wye, I do as well, but not really the Dee. And I think that fits a Marcher perspective as well, because the suddenness of the change, because often in the basins of the Severn and the Wye, the change is kind of, I was saying it was both sharp and saggy, the border. Much more saggy in the southern 2/3. In the northern third, in the Dee Basin, much, much sharper. I mean, some of the times when you go from Flintshire into Cheshire, it's like that. And you're like, wow, gosh, it's quite extraordinary. And sometimes it absolutely took my breath away. And then you think, they are the most unequal county twins going, Cheshire and Flintshire. I mean, when I was researching the book, I was collecting everything I could possibly. I was watching everything and reading everything I could lay my hands on. I even kind of watched a few episodes of a dreadful series called The Real Housewives of Cheshire, which they ain't housewives and they ain't real, is all I can say to that. But I mean, it got me thinking, there will never be, The Only Way is Flintshire. That's never going to be a reality TV series. So, there was a real sharp, and a much, if you look at the counties of, say Shropshire against Montgomeryshire, or Herefordshire and Radnorshire, or Monmouthshire and Gloucestershire, there's a much greater parity either side of the line than there is in that top bit. So that was the top bit, and then of course down in the bottom, the Wye. Actually, technically, that's the River Monnow. Well, it's not technically, that is the River Monnow, just short of where it joins the River Wye, but it's a sort of a good Wye scape in lots of ways. Lots of cattle, that kind of bucolic nature of the Wye Basin in so many ways. And one of the echoes that I found there in that part of the borderlands was, thinking a lot about the Normans and thinking a lot about and how. It's often, when I've been in Breconshire and Herefordshire and Radnorshire and Monmouthshire and that kind of western bit of Gloucestershire, it's often over the years slightly reminded me of kind of La France profonde, that sense. You drive down lanes and there's a sort of sense of Frenchness to it almost. And I think, that Norman echo is still very much there. And you think about, the things that area is famous for, the cider and the apples and the venison and the pork and all things that the Normans would have been extremely familiar with. So, the echoes continue down the line. But of course, in 1536, as I said earlier, a border was drawn. For all the elasticity of the Marcher lands, a border was drawn through them. And of course, some places slightly ended up, one side that wasn't necessarily their best fit. And I want to just read a little section now from the Clun Forest, which is one such. It's the deepest lunge. You can see the border there, the red line going there. Here we are in the bottom right, Ludlow, you'll see. And then over there is Clun. And just to the west of Clun is Offa's Dyke, and then just to the west of that is more Shropshire. That's the deepest gouge of England into Wales. And that far area of the Clun Forest, an old Welshery, technically in England, but it's very, very much, it feels like it's not quite in the right place. And I was talking there about the pandemic earlier on. If we go close up to the very end of that part of the border, so there it is. And you'll see there's a place called Castle Bryn Amlwg, which is this place here, Castell Bryn Amlwg. The hill on the obvious, the castle on the obvious hill. I always thought Bryn Amlwg meant, Castell Bryn Amlwg meant the obvious castle, but no, it's the obvious hill, or the famous, then there it is. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of this because I talked about the pandemic, and this was my first trip, because of course when we were not allowed to cross the border, when I was doing my research, my first trip from England, the longest time I'd not been in England actually since growing up here, was a trip to see Bryn Amlwg in my research. And it was like the most lightning border raid I could think of. You know, I could just tiptoe across, have a quick look at this place that I wanted to research. And it amazed me. So this is thinking about it in that context of that particular time 4 years ago. Though it meanders through some of the least populated areas of southern Britain, this section of the border is an electric fence, live and potentially lethal when plugged in. But once the switch is flicked, inert and almost invisible. Right now, with everyone so twitchy in the pandemic, the gauge on the dial is rising, and there's every chance of a shock. This is a border whose significance ebbs and flows, that swims in and out of focus down the centuries, and there's no more apposite symbol of that than Castell Bryn Amlwg. Like Frankenstein's monster, it only flickered into life when Powys surged along the line, and it once again became a key garrison of either side. Between times, it slipped back into torpor, a forgotten field of a faraway world. Though no buildings remain, there's a thumping functionalism here, a hardness even in the wiry grass folds and wind-bitten hawthorns, and it's clear that this was never a place for the courtly life. Bryn Amlwg, high in the hills, and with its outer walls nearly 9 feet thick, was brute force. At this border crossing, lawlessness hangs like cordite on the breeze and seeps into everything. A century ago, there was much more of the castle to see. As well as fragments of the walls, there remained the base of a Norman keep and a later double gatehouse. It all disappeared in the 1950s. Contractors working for a Shrewsbury seed merchant who bought 2 local farms and wanted to pave the track between them plundered every last stone. A passerby reported it to the police, but by the time the case came to magistrates at Clun Town Hall, too much time had elapsed for a successful prosecution. Even the course of the border was a victim of crime. In 1691, a pedlar died, murdered, it's said, a couple of miles further north on the Kerry Ridgeway. His death caused a dust-up between the parishes on either side of the line, for neither wanted the responsibility and expense of his burial. Eventually, goes the story, the authorities of Betws-y-Croen accepted his corpse, buried him in the churchyard, and placed a stone where they said that he died, some distance north of the track. Almost 2 centuries later, when the land was being enclosed, the position of the stone was used to fix the border, giving Betws and the local landowner MP some extra acres at the expense of the parish of Kerry. Betws-y-Croen in England versus Kerry in Wales. The sense of identity here is as mashed as the names. After dipping my toe into England at Bryn Amlwg, I return a few months later and plunge into the land beyond, the Clun Forest proper. Despite frequent excursions along the roads and rivers around its edges, the forest is somewhere I've barely explored before, and it thrills me. Much to my surprise, it also makes me cry. I followed the lanes up to Betws-y-Croen Church, one of the highest in Shropshire, sat looking down over its diffuse parish of farms, woods and fields of thin pickings. My expectations were of a single cell barn, thick-set and windswept, tucked into a corner of a gloomy cemetery. Instead, there's a grand green avenue leading to the gate, flowers flooding the graveyard, and a sense of such occasion that by the time I try the door and find that after so many months of lockdown, it creaks open and I'm embraced by the dark wood interior and musty scent of centuries. The relief punches me in the gut and tears start to fall, hot and grateful. I knew that I'd missed ambling around country churches, a favourite pastime since childhood, but not that I needed it like I needed to breathe. The tears were a long overdue admission of that, but they were also the uncorking of a sadness that had been brewing throughout the pandemic and had pulled into the dark corners of my psyche where I hardly dare look. That this all came tumbling out in St Mary's, Betws-y-Croen, was not just about this moment in history. It was also a response to a very specific geography, one that rouses me without fail every time, the historic districts of Wales that are now administratively in England. The Normans established the concept of the marches, a wide and distinct buffer zone between England and Wales, an official land of neither here nor there, where each country shaded into its neighbour. 4.5 centuries later. In order to bring all of Wales into the English county system, the border that we know today was defined in the Laws and Wales Acts of 1536 and 1542. Inevitably, chunks of territory on both sides ended up on the wrong side of the line. Betus y Croen is a prime example. Welsh in name and temperament, well to the west of Offa's Dyke, yet surgically excised from its motherland by turf wars, treaties, and the slow hiss of time. In the churchyard, happily ablaze with fox and cubs and buttercups, I meet a couple laying flowers on a grave, his grandmother's, it turns out. He grew up nearby and now lives in Kerry village, over the border. Though as far as he's concerned, it's all Welsh. Half a millennium has barely scratched the surface. And that's something I kind of came across so often. Half a millennium has barely scratched the surface. We're about, we're only 10 years away, 12 years away from the border's 500th anniversary. It's half a millennium birthday. And yet there are so many bits where no one's told them, basically. Oswestry, the Welshest town, Croesoswallt, the Welshest town in England. There's so many examples of that in Oswestry. So many of the names are Welsh. That shop on the left there with a yellow thing over it, that used to be kind of a Welsh bookshop about 10 years ago, and that's now moved. It's still in the market hall in Oswestry, Shop Cullum, sort of centre for the Welsh language in Shropshire. This statue, this fabulous statue by Ivor Roberts Jones, is called the Borderland Farmer, and you look at him and you know damn well that is a man of two languages. He doesn't use many words in either, but he nonetheless is a man of two languages for sure. If you've got the time, have a look on, there's a wonderful clip on YouTube. If you remember in the 70s when they were tinkering around with the county borders and we were bequeathed, Hereford and Worcester, which I'll talk about in a bit, and Powys and all the rest of it. There was some discussion that Oswestry might be moved into Wales. And so Nationwide, that early evening sort of television magazine show, sent a film crew to Oswestry, this is 1972, on market day to vox pop people in the market to say, do you think this would be a good idea for Oswestry to be moved back into Wales? And it's on YouTube, it's really worth having a look at. Virtually everybody thought they already were. And it really was news to quite a few people go, oh, we're not, all right. So yes, as I say, that half millennium makes very little odds to some people. Then this land down in the southwest of Herefordshire, I mean, it's one that I didn't know too well, fascinated me. Again, as sort of an old, the old Welsh kingdoms of Erging and of Uwas, now in Herefordshire. But of course, this was always a bit of a buffer zone. I mean, when Offa built the dike, as you can see, the line of the dike that's extant there, in the kind of hashed lining going down it, there's no Offa's Dyke in that patch. It is not. It was for whatever reason, it was sufficiently elastic or sufficiently peaceful or whatever the reason was. There was no need to build this demarcation line in the way that had been north and south of it. This is a long-standing factor. Now, the old Welsh kingdom of Uwas has been anglicised as Archenfield, of course, and here the village. The picture behind is the village of Clodogh, the churchyard of the village of Clodogh. And the border as it stands today is that line you see ahead of you there. One of my theories about why this area is so sort of comfortable in its dual nationality is because the border itself, as it stands today, is absolutely inarguable because it is that 10-mile Hatterall Ridge, 2,000 feet up, that goes all the way along the edge of the Black Mountains. And I think having a border that is so... this is 6 o'clock on a June morning 2 summers ago. It looks absolutely idyllic. But when I arrived in Clodogh the night before, the sun was off that, it was this black wall fencing us in. There was no doubting at all about the sheer strength of it. And in this part of Herefordshire, I found a phenomenon that absolutely blew me away. I was staying in the pub in Longtown, just up the way from Clodogh. And the landlady of the pub asked me what I was doing. I said, I'm researching a book about the Wales-England border. And she said, this used to be Wales. I said, yes, that's right. She said, 50, 60 years ago, this was Wales. I didn't want to look like too much of a smart aleck and go, well, actually, I think you'll find it's 500. But, yes. I was like, yes, that's right. And then later the same day, I had almost identical conversation with a farmer just up the road, who was about 80. The landlady in the pub was about 40. This guy was about double her age. And he said, oh, my farm used to be Wales. I said, yes, yes. So that's right, I gather. He said, yeah, 100 years ago, this farm was Wales. So to the 40-year-old landlady, it was sort of 50, 60 years ago. To the 80-year-old farmer, it was 100 years ago. And that, I think, is almost a textbook definition of a folk memory in action, this sense of Welshness there in the land, in the turf, in the soil, but just out of personal reach. You know, people don't necessarily want to date it, they don't want to know the history of it, but it's there in their DNA, it's there in their heads. It's the kind of sense of Welshness, almost like, you know, like the smell of your grandmother's baking, you know, that whisks you back in a moment, or a tune that you hear that you haven't heard for 30 years, and suddenly you're whisked back in time. It was that sense of its identity, and that was fascinating. I'd never ever come across before. And of course, this area, this southwest corner of Herefordshire, is the sort of capital of the marvellous Herefordshire Romanesque, which I think in so many ways is the sort of it feels like the house style in a way, this 12th century school of ecclesiology that really doesn't get the attention it deserves outside of there. I mean, I grew up in Kidderminster, as I say. There's some of the best examples of the Herefordshire Romanesque in villages like Rock and Chasley Corbett, 2 or 3 miles away from the house that I grew up in. I never knew any of this stuff when I was growing up. You know, even locally, we were absolutely ignorant of the magnificence of right under our noses. So this was the patch that I think when I was researching the book, I most wanted to return to. And I went, after the book came out last year, I went and walked the Golden Valley Pilgrim Way, which means sleeping in some of the churches. I slept in Clodagh Church, Craswell Church, Michael Church Escley, and many others as well. It was an amazing thing. And this is an area where the borders really blur, where, you know, the castles here at Longtown, there are castles, but there are castles that look like farms. There are churches that look like castles. There are farms that look like churches. You know, the uses of things have mutated over the centuries, and it all sort of starts to blur. All the boundaries start to blur, as the national boundary has indeed blurred. I talked to a lot of people researching the book, and there's a great quotation I'd like to share with you from a guy called Andy Johnson, who was the founder of the very fabulous Logiston Press, which is a sort of Herefordshire independent publisher, done marvellous work over the years. I see there's some Logiston books on there. I know. When I was talking to him, he was saying that they once did a book launch in Radnorshire during the time of the devolution referendum in 1997 in Wales. And he said that when they were, what came across to him was they didn't really want a Welsh Assembly there, but they wanted one for Radnorshire, Montgomeryshire, Brecconshire, Shropshire and Herefordshire, for that was the unit that they feel a part of, which I'm sure will ring many a familiar bell for you lot. And he also said that this sort of crossover, this toing and froing has always happened. And his words were exactly, whatever warfare was going on, I like, he said, the very porous feeling to the border, the pleasingly complicated and slightly mysterious. So there's places on the wrong side, as did a few there. There's also lots of places in between. The Maylord, this little patch down here, this bit on the map, this protrusion. I remember on the atlases of my childhood, that was always marked as Flintshire brackets detached, which worried me enormously as a kind of junior map nerd. Why was it detached? What had happened to it? You know, was it missing its relatives? You know, and it's always held that this is a part of Wales that's an unfortunate oversight. You know, it's far to the east of Offa's Dyke and Watts Dyke, of course. And lots of historians will write with great confidence that it shouldn't really be Wales. Nobody there wants it to be Wales. That really wasn't what I found at all. Another famous place between, that's where I started off. That's the Mosses. I started my research into the Maylord, but on the Mosses, which is this like massive, thousands and thousands of acres of peat bog. Really quite a staggering part of the country, because of course it's absolutely sort of featureless, and yet the border rips through it, and you have to depend on these posts to tell you which side you're now on. But on the edge of the Maylord, there was one place that I found which really genuinely is a place between the two, and historically was so for centuries, and that's Threepwood, this map here. So now it's in Cheshire. That's the border that I've marked on the map there. Flintshire detached, the Maylord to your left, Cheshire to your right. But for centuries, Threepwood hovered between the two. It fell between the two. It wasn't in Flintshire, it wasn't in Cheshire, it was extra parochial, it was in no fixed parish at all. So it was common land. Nobody paid taxes to anybody. There was no lord of the manor. So, you know, as you can imagine, once the enclosures started, people started to go, hang on a minute, there's this huge patch. In the case of Threepwood or Threpwood, I'm not entirely, people could pronounce it differently to me in different ways. We'll call it Threepwood for now. But people described, you know, a bit worried about this place that hovered between the two, paying no taxes. That worried the politicians. And I think even on the Ordnance Survey map of today, here on the Explorer map, you can see the residue of this kind of lawlessness in that sort of jigsaw of tiny fields and scratty landscapes. You can see that this was a place apart. So there's the evidence on the 21st century Ordnance Survey map of a place that fell between the stools, if you like. And what was so fascinating about Threepwood was that it became famous for one particular facet. I mean, there were lots of things about it. There were no churches. It was famous for its racing meetings and its gambling and all the kind of things you'd expect with somewhere beyond the authorities. But it also became particularly famous as a place where unmarried mothers would go, having been thrown out of their respectable parishes in the sort of 18th and early 19th centuries, right the way into the Victorian age. This was the case. And Threepwood was the place. There were homes dotted around the common, run by women, for the reception of disgraced young girls who got into trouble, and they would come there, having been kicked out of their home parishes, probably by the people that got them up the duff in the first place. Let's be honest, you know. But I find that wonderful. I find that absolutely wonderful that a place of enforced exile actually became this place of sort of very welcome and necessary sanctuary. So, you know, it just goes to show something rather kind of marvellous. But carrying on with the places in between, Hay, of course, Hay on Wye, the Hay, La Hay, always been very much a place apart. There's King Richard I, the late Richard Booth, and the fact that he, in 1977, declared Hay independent of the UK, I think tapped into this residual memory of the place as being a bit of a place apart. It worked to treat in Hay because it already felt to itself neither one side nor the other. And it was a kind of Liechtenstein. He called it a British Liechtenstein. It always worked really well as that. I interviewed him, there he is, King Richard with me, looking considerably younger, about 20 years ago, on a television programme that I did. And he knighted me. He'd had quite a lot of strokes by this point, and he was terribly shaky. And my dog was with me. I was filming this series with me and my dog trundling around in a camper van. And as he was kind of holding and shaking the sword around my shoulders, I think my dog was getting exceedingly stressed. And then about 8 months later, my phone went at home. And I picked up the phone and his voice said, "Hello, it's the castle." I said, "Sorry, which castle?" "Hay Castle, of course. Have you received your scroll, your certificate of, because Sir Richard, King Richard has knighted you." "Oh, no, I haven't." And then it came in the post. It was addressed to, the tube that it came in was addressed to Sir Michael, Lord of Caenus. I was living in the village of Caenus Escargaliog at the time, and the postman actually bothered to knock just so he could hand it over to me with the biggest of smirks you've ever quite seen. But I think that, Richard Booth he did this kind of comedy independent kingdom, but there was a nugget in there that was true. His railing against the quangos and the sort of top-down solutions very much found an echo in the independent-minded borderlands, and we see it time and time again. It's resistant, I think, to top-down solutions. But it is very pertinent to me because this is land that I grew up in, and I want to just talk to you. One of the things I said earlier on about how being part of the Marcher lands. I grew up. I'm a Worcestershire lad, as was A.E. Houseman. Indeed, of course, he was a Bromsgrove fella, not Shropshire at all. But I had no sense until writing this book. I mean, I knew the theory that Worcestershire was one of the Marcher counties at one stage. I didn't. But there was no sense of it being any kind of impact on us today. And when I started to dig into it, it really brought home how much I'd been denied of my own sort of history, if you like. So Kidderminster, top up there, that's where I grew up. And then, I grew up in the era of Hereford and Worcester, which is sort of, the counties merged in the 70s. And it's a bit of a throwback to the Marcher kingdoms in some way, and it sort of worked. I loved it. I found, because growing up in workaday humdrum Kidderminster, suddenly we were so much more exciting. We had Herefordshire as our little kind of thing to play with as well, and it made us a border county. I loved the fact that that made us officially a border county, and Kidderminster Harriers could play in the Welsh FA Cup for that period and win it. No, they didn't win it. They came and got in the final twice, I might add. But yes, this was really quite, quite an eye-opener to me that there was a Marcher history to talk about. Humphrey Lloyd, the map maker, the Welsh map maker, he produced this map in 1572, the first one that showed Wales as a discrete entity, with the border of Wales going all the way to the River Severn. I'll come back to that map in a wee sec. But this was an idea that I think I bumped up to. You'll see there Humphrey Lloyd's map, and there is Kidderminster, next to the Severn, next to Wales, and making us the border town that I always kind of felt that it was. And then we look at names that no one ever explained. There's the border, according to Humphrey Lloyd, just down the road from us, on the outskirts of Bewdley, on the English side of the river. Reeve Covert, Reeve, the Welsh for free. Was that some relation to Welsh people being had to be let free at that point? Because another one up the road, Catcham's End, that was the last chance to catch a Welshman. That's where the name comes from, and sort of finish them off, because if they got over the Severn, they were back on their side of the river and safe and free. So loads of questions in names of this area, and along the valley of the River Team, going in at the bottom there. I've highlighted it in red. The Team goes from here in Ludlow down to Worcester, and that was clearly the Welsh egress into England, because there's loads of Welsh names that have been anglicised: Menithwood, Pensax, Menith from Mynydd, Mountain, Frith Common, Frith being the kind of rough pasture land, Pensax, the head of the Saxon lands. So many of these names refer back. I mean, we heard all the time when I was a young man, Bewdley. I've just shown you Bewdley on the map. We were told so often, oh yes, of course, that refers, its name comes from the French, Beaulieu, the beautiful place, which is true. We were never once told that Malvern, that great other Worcestershire town, that's a Welsh name, Moelfren, the bald hill. And in fact, I did a reading last year in Malvern, and I asked the people in the crowd, did they know about this? And nobody did. Nobody in that town knew that it was a Welsh origin name. So we've sort of squashed down the Welsh origins of so much of that part of Worcestershire, and this was a real revelation. We were never taught at school about, there's Owain Glyndwr's camp, he'd come down the Severn, this is the furthest east he got in his campaign in the early 1400s, a week-long siege on Woodbury Hill, him on the one hill, the forces of Henry IV, Prince Hal as he was then, on Aberley Hill, and they stared at each other eyeball to eyeball across that landscape for a week in 1405. We were told none of this, absolutely none of this. The history of Worcestershire that we were given at school, it was kind of the other view from the Aberley Hills, which is this, the clock tower, the sort of mock Westminster. That was what we were always taught in Worcestershire. We were taught to think about the Civil War, Worcestershire's place in the Civil War, the Battle of Worcester, all those sort of things, but nothing at all about the Marcher history, about its place and its relationship with Wales. And learning all this in adulthood and particularly in the research that I did for All the Wide Border, was an absolute kind of eye-opener. But as a child in the 70s and 80s in Worcestershire, incontrovertibly so, our eyes were always turned east and south, never, ever to the west. And that deliberate skewing of history, I just want to show you a few maps that kind of really make this point, you know, from your era, from the medieval era, the early medieval era. The Goth map of 1360 there, you'll see, so I've turned it around in the smaller version, that's Britain. Of course, the detail is so much better on the, you know, on the south and the east. And as you get to the west, and let's look at Wales and the west of England on the next one, in close-up, that's Wales and the west. So you've got the River Severn there, you've got the Wye there. But the purpose of the Goth map was really to show roads, it's thought, the road network as it existed in 1360. Very rudimentary roads, obviously. There's 3,000 miles of track and road shown on the map, only 2 in Wales. And this shows you how mapping was done. Again, all eyes to the east and south. Because the 2 roads shown on the map, there's this one here from Hereford, going east to Carmarthen and then down to sort of St David's. That's sort of modern day A40, that exists, all right. But the only other road shown in Wales is one connecting all the new castles of Edward I around the coast, all the way down to Cardigan. You know, so you've got kind of Flint and Rhuddlan and Conwy and Carnarvon and Beaumaris and all the way down to Harlech and Aberystwyth and Cardigan. And that's a road that's never, ever existed. So this was absolutely a way of saying, you know, Wales is much safer for, it was Wales through English eyes. This, you know, this road, it's a safe land to go and invade, basically. And as the final bit of sort of, I'd like to leave you with on that thought, is this big blob in the middle of the map, this great big green blob. That's Pumlummon. Now, Pumlummon, the mountain, appears on all medieval maps of Wales. It is only his, you know, even the later ones, John Speed's 1610 Atlas of Britain. There in the middle again is Pumlummon, shown as one of the main mountains of Wales. It's the 49th highest peak in Wales, and yet it appears on all these medieval maps. And this goes back to what Matt was saying in the last talk about, you know, we were defeated by the Welsh landscape, not by Welsh soldiers, but by the landscape. And this is a warning to invaders that, you know, Pumlummon is a notoriously dark and difficult peak. It's an upland bog. Glyndŵr had his most successful battle there on its side at the Battle of Howthgen. So it's mapping propaganda, not mapping fact. And again, it's showing Wales and the rest of the country always map from the point of view of the southeastern corner. And it goes on still today. Or not quite so, you know, we can see, I'll show you a modern map in a sec. Even more extreme in the map that comes from Owain Glyndŵr's era. This was a map done for the monks of Evesham Abbey in 1410. Glyndŵr, of course, was, you know, his campaign was at its full flight. Edward I was also fighting, sorry, not Henry. Henry was also fighting against the Scots, was in war against. So what we have, I'll put labels on it to show you what we're looking at a bit. It's a typical mappa mundi, as in, like you have in Hereford, with the Mediterranean in the middle, the very, very, very Red Sea on the right-hand side, Asia, Europe, Africa. And Wales and Ireland is shown as an island, fair enough, Ireland is an island, but so are Wales and Scotland, as you'll see over there on the far corner. And they're shown as almost featureless islands as well. You know, England, that huge mass that goes all the way from Gibraltar, the mouth of the Mediterranean, all the way up to Scandinavia, is shown as full of abbeys and cities and towns and cathedrals, a place of great importance. Wales and Scotland shown as featureless lumps, offshore featureless lumps. Years ago, I went to a lecture at the British Library by Peter Barber, who was the map librarian of the British Library at the time. And he described this beautiful line. He said this was the UKIP map of the world from the 15th century. So this is not just a tendency that's happened then. This is a 1965 map, birthplaces of the notable people of the past, from the Reader's Digest. what an amazing coincidence. Nobody of any worth got born in Wales. I mean, it's so, you know, this is a tendency that kind of goes on. Back to Humphrey Lloyd, though. I just want to rattle through a few last bits. He mapped. This was, as I said, the first map to show Wales as a discrete, entire entity of its own. And him putting the border over to the River Severn is a cheeky one. I mean, it's you know, it's only 30 years after, you know, the border has been put in place, the county system has been established, the marches are supposedly forced into history, and he's sort of reawakening the idea and cocking a bit of a snook at Henry VIII at the same time, I think. And of course, you know, this is quite what would be called, I suppose, a slight Welsh nationalist view of the world. I mean, we've had a lot of English nationalist views of the world. This is a bit of a Welsh nationalist one, including the fact that he always gives the cities and towns in both Latin, or in three languages, Latin and Welsh and English. And there's Worcester, you see, on the River Severn in the bit blown up. Vigonia in Latin, Caerrangon in Welsh, and Worcester in English. And in some ways, it's a nod to this, I think. You know, the idea of, you know, had Glyndŵr and Mortimer and Percy been successful in carving the lands up between the three in the tripartite indenture, this is more or less the sort of the land as it would have been. And Humphrey Lloyd's map is a sort of sly, cheeky nod to that way of thinking. And that's a map that I don't think is, you know, it doesn't exist, it never happened, but it kind of did as well. You know, that is a natural way of splitting. If you're going to split them anywhere, that is a sort of natural way of doing it. But I suppose, you know, that sort of slightly more wide take on our geography is something, you know, Mortimer and Glyndŵr, two of the three people responsible for the tripartite indenture, both men of the march. Of course, Glyndŵr was just as much Owain Glyndŵr, just as much a man of the march as Mortimer, as the Mortimer family. There's what's left of the mound of his palace at Sycharth, and there is Sycharth, 5 fields from the border as it stands today. He is so close to being an Englishman in the way that we look at it today. And his life and his death were all in the marches. And of course, most famously, his death, an absolute mystery. I mean, 4 of his daughters married into Herefordshire families, and it is assumed, we have no idea quite when he died. We know he vanished, probably into Herefordshire. It's almost certain that he vanished into Herefordshire, one of his daughters. And it is often assumed that it was at this place, Kentchurch Court, because one of his daughters had married into the Scudamore family, who still own Kentchurch Court today. And in fact, I was doing a radio programme a few years ago for Radio Wales about what happened to Glyndŵr at the end of his life. And we stayed overnight at Kentchurch, and I got to stay in what's said to be Owain Glyndŵr's bedroom, and there it is. And there's a sort of secret passageway behind a panel so it's very exciting. And then when you look, you know, apparently Glyndŵr kept a horse saddled and ready just below his window, so that, you know, if trouble came, he could just vault out of the window onto the horse, or whoosh, it'd be away. That's the Scudamores story. But it is amazing that when you think about the price that was on his head, if he went to ground in Herefordshire, into the march, into this baggy, soft, indeterminate land, that nobody snitched on him. You know, people would have known where he was. And there was a huge, huge bounty on his head, and yet nobody in Herefordshire snitched. So I think that tells you a lot about the identity of people then and probably now. All of this can be overdone. It can be overdone in all kinds of directions. I mean, Glyndŵr, we can make of him the man who disappeared. He becomes the kind of Robin Hood character for Wales. You know, the king of prophecy. You know, the vanished one. All that kind of stuff. And the Welsh, of course, will have embellished him beautifully, and as seen no better than in the town of Corwen, near where one of his Glyndwrdwy was. There's one of his palaces. This is the statue that used to be there until 2006, and that was, which I always thought looked a little bit like the late Robin Cook on a plinth. It didn't quite convey the message. And now, no, there he is now, the new statue. So, you know, that's sort of visual representation, really, of the way that he's been kind of beefed up as a figure of Welsh history. So, as always, really, I guess well, you know, in French, Matt was using a lot of French, la vérité est entre les deux. You know, it's neither the supremely English version of events nor the supremely Welsh version of events. And that is the march. That is what this land holds, the nub of something really important and really vital for the way we are today, I think, in lots of ways. There's a sort of, when I was researching the book, I found this incredible sort of, especially during the pandemic when the line was so hard, but there was this incredible kind of give and take and resilience and resourcefulness of the people of the march. And I think that very much goes back to all of the reasons that I've talked about and you've thought about lots over the years. And you see it in the towns like, you know, the bigger towns, you know, like here in Ludlow. That was taken 6 o'clock one summer morning when I was staying here. Before anybody else was in the streets. It's quite magical, Ludlow at that time of day, as you can imagine, in those sort of conditions. But all the way up and down the line, these tiny little towns, you know, not just places like Ludlow, which are massive by comparison with, you know, Prestine or Bishop's Castle or Montgomery or Clun or Hay or, you know, Knighton and Kington. All of those slightly mad towns, and they've all got a sort of certain kind of wackiness to them, but it's a wonderful strength. They are unique in this world of homogeneity and all the rest of it. They really hold it. And that is because they are on the border and because they are in this kind of neither here nor there world. And it's one that I think we should absolutely celebrate. So I'm going to finish with not my words, but the words of, I use this as the opener to All the Wide Border. It's a quotation from a 1932 novel by the great Margiad Evans, a novel called Country Dance. And this is setting the scene for all that I wanted to talk about, really, in my book. Gwen has put out the blackberry wine. It sets the men to singing reckless words from men of Harlech, despite his mutters and angry looks. One of them jumps up from his place, shouting, "I drink to Wales!" Gabriel roars, "And I to England," and stands facing the other across the table. Megan and Margiad clap their hands. Mary looks serious. "There'll be trouble in a minute. The men are hot as coals," she whispers. Gwen purses her lips. "I give the border," she says, very quiet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was such a fabulous way to end such an interesting day. It sort of seemed to pull all the threads together, didn't it? We've got time for some quick questions before we end. There we go.
Hi, great talk, Mike.
Thank you.
Something that I just want to check, because it's been a long day. Did I hear you say that when Hereford and Worcester, or Herefordshire and Worcestershire joined, you were very pleased?
Well, they were.
Were you pleased?
I was thrilled. I was absolutely thrilled. I was 7 years old. It made, I mean, well, a lot of you will know Kidderminster. It's not the most exciting town to grow up in, I've got to say. You know, the fact that it was the only place when I was a kid in Western Europe where you could do a degree in carpet studies was the single interesting fact about the place. And yeah, I was absolutely thrilled because, and I remember even as a 7-year-old, I mean, this is how much of a kind of map nerd I was. bouncing into my dad and my stepmom and going, do you realise now the highest point in our county isn't the Malvern Hills anymore, it's the Black Mountains. It's doubled in size overnight. And they were just like, what is this child?
Very quickly, why I ask.
Yes.
I'm a Vale of Ewis girl. I know Cleddock, I know the area so well.
Right.
And we all thought it didn't mean us.
But I think it was great. I mean, obviously, people in Herefordshire, they hated it because it was a takeover. It was a takeover, and I can completely understand why they. I do think I had an idea of trying to write a book in praise of those 1970s counties, actually, because I think there's a lot of good sense in them, actually, in terms of administrative. But it's not happened yet, and I realise I'm on thin ice when I say that to a lot of people.
That was really great, and a lot of it resonated with me. I was born on Tyneside and lived on the Cumbrian border with Scotland in the very early 60s in various communes on the River Tyne, way inland in the 70s, and spoke to people who, rather like you were just describing, thought that the border reivers may be coming over the hills just any minute, had no kind of real sense of history, and merged their history into like 500 years previous as if it was now. And there's a lot of similarities. The borders don't really exist properly. The actual technical border is miles away, but it doesn't follow the Tyne, it doesn't follow Hadrian's Wall. You can go down little tracks that disappear into nowhere. There are no real villages. But there's one really big difference, which is that there's nothing below. And there's nothing above. There's nothing below or above the border there, because it's just barren. There are no towns, Cumberland on one side, Newcastle, South Shields and so forth on the other side. But here you've got towns all the way down the border, haven't you? Yeah. So why do we talk about the marches here, but not the Scottish, Northumbrian, Cumbrian marches?
Well, I would say to that, I think you put your finger on it, that the difference between the sort of English-Scottish border and the English-Welsh border, they're both as venerable and as deep as each other in different ways. But I think, the Scottish border goes across a very narrow neck of the country through very unpopulated landscapes. I mean, yes, you've got Carlisle, Dumfries, Berwick, of course, traditionally, the border, poster child of the border, really. But for the most part, it goes through very, very unfrequented landscape. And I think, there's that sense, of course, that, you're already 300 miles from London as well, whereas the Welsh-English border is within an hour of Manchester and Birmingham and Bristol and Liverpool and big English cities, and all the towns across there. I mean, the comparison I make in all the wide border between the Scottish border, I've got to think of them, the Scottish border is like a traditional wheel of Scottish shortbread, which has had the grooves baked into it. You can snap really easily. I mean, you can imagine, whatever your political thoughts about Scottish independence or whatever else, you can imagine it happening. It wouldn't be that difficult to snap the kind of thing. The Welsh-English border, as a piece of sweet treat, it's not a piece of shortbread. What I compare it to in the book is, a very moist slab of batter breath, which is, it's neither bread nor cake. It's kind of halfway between the two, and it's an absolute bugger to slice. So, I think there is a really qualitative, major difference, and that's what I try to unpick really in the book. But it's fascinating me. But we don't hear much about it as well. Yeah.
One more question here, which I think will need to be the last one. Thank you, Mike. That was so interesting. I'm from just by Kingston, so that resonated in lots of different ways for me. But my question was about how in the Middle Ages, the March of Lordships extended in all of what we think of as now modern South Wales. And how do you sort of account for that in your idea of these marcher echoes?
Into South Wales?
Yeah.
Oh no, I didn't. That wasn't my purview really. I mean, do you mean like as in going sort of south into Glamorgan and across into? Yeah. No. I mean, I was writing about the Wales-England border and incorporating what there is of the kind of marcher mentality into that. I mean, I absolutely, I have written about the way those echoes kind of go across Wales. So the divide between North and South Gower and North and South Pembrokeshire and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's you know, those are very, very strong and apparent and clear today for sure. But they don't really feature in this particular book because it was specifically. But that is fascinating. I mean, I think it is more proof that however much life changes and however much technology moves us on in all kinds of ways, the building blocks, the basic stuff, the stuff of the soil, the stuff of the earth beneath our feet, that doesn't change all that much, you know, and the identities within that. And that's quite a thought when you grapple with it. Yeah.
As somebody who is an historian of the March of Lordships, when I give a talk about the March of Lordships, I'm quite often asked about, well, you know, what can we see of the March of Lordships today? What was the impact? And after I've made a few erudite comments about, well, the language, structure, administration, politics, some of the things that Mike touched on, I must admit, I then do just say, oh, sod it, buy Mike's book and read it, and then
That's fine with me, Philip. That's fine with me.
that tells you all you need to know about the impact of the Welsh marches and the echoes in modern life. So thanks very much, Mike.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.